All right, here is our case study surrounding the topic of malpractice. Um, it's one of those things I never thought I would really truly encounter in my profession because I was like, oh, this happens, but it really doesn't happen. But it does happen. So, I'm going to kind of walk through the scenario and everything. I might use a little discretion about details just because I do respect the privacy of the clinician. I don't respect the choices, but also respect that sometimes people make choices that I don't agree with, and for whatever reason they do it, and that's what it is. So it might be a little bit vague at times on details, and so you might hopefully don't feel left lacking. Hopefully I can also get this into the 15 minutes that this recording app allows. So this, again, most of my context comes from working at the mental health clinic. And so, again, it's a scenario from there. It was when I was in the clinical supervisor role. So I was in charge of providing clinical supervision for all of our therapists and case managers. And so this particular therapist, I actually had recruited to come work in come to work in our clinic because I really thought she did good work with clients. She engaged well. I thought she had a good grasp on like documentation, assessment. And so that to me just makes this even more interesting. To make it more interesting as well, we attended the same church. I knew her husband. I took care of her children in children's church. So we kind of had some connections and overlap in the outside world as well. So this particular therapist was working with a client who was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. He had PTSD. He also had a pretty significant substance use issue, specifically surrounding alcohol. And so this client was referred to us because he would often present to the emergency room or to Network 180 in crisis, expressing suicide. He even had some attempts, I believe. A lot of it was connected to his substance use, and then when he was in a stage of impairment, he would kind of act out on some of those like suicidal ideations. Network 180 was very frustrated with this client because despite any interventions that were taken, he continued to have this pattern. He was inappropriately, like the psych hospital was not necessarily what he needed. He needed substance use services. He needed therapy to address the trauma. Going into the psych hospital would keep him safe for the moment, but it was not a long-term and viable intervention, and it was very costly to continue having him assessed and sent there when he really needed to address the problems in a different stage and level of care. So he came to our clinic and he began receiving services with his therapist. And he actually started to demonstrate a level of stability. He had reported sobriety for moments, decreased hospitalizations, and it was very positive. The therapist at the time, unrelated to anything with him, was really started to present a little manic, I felt, in her presentation in just everyday life. She started dressing a little bit more, I don't want to say provocatively, but not as dumpy, for lack of a better word. So paying more attention to her outward appearance. She was exercising more. She was reporting positive mental health because she had been open to me in the past that she struggled with anxiety and depression herself. So she was offered medications. She was expressing that she was doing very well. And so kind of having that context, she came to me after working with this client for, I can't honestly remember, maybe let's say like 6 months, and disclosed to me that she was having some physical attraction and like emotional attraction to this client. And I, first of all, applauded for her for having the self-awareness, because that's really huge, like understanding that this is something that is present and it's there. But she felt like it wasn't beneficial to the client. Sorry, she just turned on. How does a 8-month-old turn on a flashlight? Anyways, she felt it was in the client's best interest to continue working with him because he had made improvements in his stability that had, she was working with him on his, there was a lot of sexual trauma that he had experienced in his life, and he was being open and vulnerable with her. He had decreased his drinking. He was identifying sobriety. And so she really felt it would be harmful for him to end their relationship. And so this is kind of where then I was struck with kind of an ethical dilemma of like valuing the self-determination of the provider, that this is what she wanted. She expressed really good awareness on how she was feeling. She was seeking supervision because through another peer around it. She disclosed it to them. She was also engaged in her own personal therapy and had reported that she disclosed it to her therapist. And so she was taking all of these steps to kind of protect herself from acting on any of these attractions. And so I consulted with my supervisor as well. And her advice actually was to encourage the termination of the relationship. But she left it up to me. And I determined that I would allow it as long as she continued to meet with me every other week to talk about how she was feeling, and that she committed to engaging in her therapy and engaging in her outside consultation as well. So that was kind of one of the like pivotal points in this. And looking back, I wish that I would have put the kibosh on that relationship and kind of went with my gut. I think there was some fear because we had been peers, we had a relationship, that I didn't feel good like telling her what to do per se. Sorry, I'm messing with my computer. And so the relationship continued on. It eventually started to unravel. I was noticing more manic behavior. She eventually disclosed to me that they had communication outside of the workplace where they would email each other. She disclosed that on her day off, he had contacted her in crisis, and she met with him at a park. Things all just kind of started to unravel and become more problematic to the point where I had to say, like, this doesn't feel very beneficial to the client. You need to end the relationship. And she still was very resistant to it, but I said, here's your time frame, work with him to kind of transition him to another therapist. Of course, he didn't want another therapist. And it ended up escalating to the point where she was taking days off because she was in crisis that matched days that he was in crisis. And it ended up one day he presented to the emergency room reporting suicidal ideation. And she left the clinic. She told me she had to take the day off, and she ended up going up to the hospital to provide support for him. And at that point, it was feeling a little bit more than just providing clinical services. So at that point, she had shared with me that she had, had done email communications with him outside. And it was all related to his treatment goals, while I had IT get me copies of their communication, and it just all came pouring out. It was very sexually charged, talking about her attraction to women, her attraction to him. She was disclosing her attraction to him. Yeah, how do you feel about that? Then talking about how she would go to his house after hours because his cat had kittens, and so going to see him for social visits. She would go to his place of employment. He worked at a restaurant. She'd take her whole family to go see him, go to the restaurant, or necessarily to see him. He then started showing up at church with her as well, and so I go to the same church as her. So that was fun. And so at that point, there was enough evidence for me to suspect that there was a sexual relationship going on. However, she had never disclosed and adamantly denied that. Well, as she was starting to unravel, I started having other coworkers come to me and say, hey, she shared with me this a while ago, but said she had it under control, so I didn't feel comfortable reporting it to you. And so had multiple people say, she shared with me these things that have gone on, that they would be in bed together, but there was no touching under the clothes. But if you have to like throw that disclaimer in there, there's shady stuff going on. And so another worker had observed her and him in an embrace outside of the agency together. So again, in public, showing like affection. Again, this is kind of gray a little bit because it involves social media. His profile picture showed him and her child. That was his featured profile picture. So at this point, we had to terminate her employment because of an inappropriate relationship. And so, of course, he denied this as well, that anything bad was going on. After I had terminated her and I had to clean out her office, I was finding love notes from him. So obviously there was all of this evidence to show that despite what she was sharing with me, and she obviously filtered and censored kind of the information she was sharing with me, that there was an inappropriate dual relationship. There was even stuff in the email saying, if you ever drink again, I will no longer talk to you. Some coercion and kind of taking advantage of the power position. So it happens. All of this to say, I can look back now and I say I made a clinical error in allowing her to continue the therapeutic relationship, basing it off of what she told me, in the belief that she was managing it. And I don't want to say that's necessarily that I had bad judgment or did something. I should have just listened to my gut that something seemed off instead of trusting and believing in her. And I kind of think I let some of my dual relationship with her as her supervisor, but also knowing her as a peer, kind of cloud my judgment as well. And then things just kind of started to reinforce her lack of boundaries. We had to escort her off the premise after we fired her, which is so awkward. And as we're riding down the elevator together, she asked that she would like to contact all of her clients to say goodbye. So again, not realizing that that's kind of inappropriate, and not respecting the termination. This happened right before I gave birth to Quinn. And on my maternity leave, I came home one day and there was a package on my front porch. And it was a gift from her. And this is after I had fired her. She had somehow found my address, took it upon herself to come to my house and leave me a gift saying that there were no hard feelings. And again, just kind of that lack of awareness of boundaries that kind of reemphasized everything that I had observed in the relationship with this client. So ended up having to report it to the licensing board. When I came back from maternity leave, I realized that the agency had never done it, and it was kind of irritating because you need to report this within X amount of days. I think it's 90 days of the violation. The agency is required to. So I think that the agency actually got dinged as well for not doing a timely report. And so I took it upon myself to report it. It opened up an investigation. I had to get interviewed multiple times by a representative from the state licensing board. She had to get interviewed. The interviewer was probably not the most island of calm during interviews. He was really irritated with her actions. And so ended up she's on probation from practicing. She has to have annual reports and check-ins that she is doing well and that she's demonstrating good judgment. She had to pay a $1,000 fine, and she will always have this on her record. To this day, I believe she thinks that she was just acting in the client's best interest and that she did nothing wrong. Thankfully, I had documented my conversations with her, so it didn't hold me liable that I was letting my staff go rogue. And so I covered my butt in that way, that I made sure to document all of our conversations. I had to call the client to make sure that he didn't express any harm, and that was not fun. Thankfully, he went to voicemail, and then he called me back, leaving me a nasty voicemail. Because at the time, he was so enmeshed in their relationship. But again, this really goes to show someone who I believed would never do something like this. Some of it was manifestation, I think, from untreated bipolar, that she was in a manic stage, and it just kind of triggered all the things. She wasn't taking her meds. And so that kind of goes back to that impairment that we talked about in regards to malpractice. So yeah, super